COVID related. And again, I have no reason to think there are with Iowa or Kentucky. We have a game this coming Saturday, Don, between two teams who have, just 3 losses apiece. Iowa, of course, a 10-win season. Kentucky with 9 wins. What have been your initial takeaways when you've looked at Kentucky on tape? You've studied the analytics. How has this team gotten to 9-3?
Well, I think Mark Stoops deserves a lot of credit. He would say that the players and the assistant coaches deserve all the credit, but Mark deserves some as well. He's a lot like Bobby, in that he's a lot like Kirk, frankly. He's going to react in all situations, but he's not going to overreact. So what you end up with, as a result of that, you end up with a lot of good, steady leadership, a lot of sound decision-making, whether it be about when spring ball should be or exactly what the workout routine should be from one week to the next. And Mark's been rewarded with a contract extension now up through the 2028 season. As you know, the SEC is a tough league, and over the last 6 years, he's exactly at 500 in conference play, and that sounds mediocre maybe to a lot of people, but you got to realize these are some of the best teams year in and year out in all of college football that are within that league. They were second in the SEC East behind Georgia. Georgia, of course, was unbeaten at 8-0, but Kentucky was at 5-3 in their conference schedule, and obviously they won their 4 non-conference games too, so that puts them at 9-3. They don't beat themselves too much of the time. What's amazing about Kentucky, Corey, as you already know, if you want to talk about a big difference between the two teams, the best place to start and end would be with turnover margin. It's really pretty hard to imagine. We're plus 13 in turnover margin, and I just checked the NCAA stats today to be sure I knew where we stood. Plus 13 puts us at a tie for third, as I recall, but we're in third place on turnover margin at plus 13. Meanwhile, Kentucky's at 128 out of 130, I might add, at minus 13. So if it's just a normal game involving our entire season and their entire season, you would expect that we would be plus 2 versus Kentucky. Here's the bad news to our fans. Plus 2 might not be good enough. The reason I say that, Corey, is because there were a couple of games in the early season where teams were plus 3, believe it or not, in turnover margin, and yet they still lost to Kentucky. And you might assume that those are a couple of mediocre teams, but that's not true either. Louisiana Monroe is a pretty darn good football team year in and year out. They were plus 3 and lost, as did South Carolina. Again, 3 and lost. So my recommendation to the football program was you better win big on turnover margin. How big? As big as you can. Plus 3 is normally a really safe number to have on your side. Just for the record, Mississippi State was the only opponent that was plus 4. Of course, they won comfortably, as most of the fans know. But plus 3 may or may not get it done. So win as big as you can on turnovers and then still win at least half of the other top parameters. And I say that because South Carolina is an example of a team that won on turnovers to the tune of plus 3 and still lost the game. How did they lose the game? I think, as I recall, they won maybe 4 out of the top 15 parameters. Obviously, they won the biggest of all in turnover margin, but they didn't win many others. The vast majority of the other top parameters went to Kentucky. And, of course, that's why I recommended the coaching staff, find a way to win half of them. You don't have to win them all, but if you win half of them, plus one of them being turnover margin, if you can be plus 2 or better on turnovers, I'd be very surprised if you don't win the game. I'll say it that way.
And you're right, 0.8 turnovers forced per game for Kentucky, which is worst in the SEC, which is astonishing given the 9-3 record. Kentucky is 4th in defensive points per game, so it's a solid unit. They just don't force a lot of turnovers. It's interesting. 6 defensive INTs, and maybe you mentioned this and I missed it, Don, but 6 defensive INTs. Half of those have been returned for touchdowns by Kentucky. So they are opportunistic when they get the ball defensively to return these touchdowns. And I don't know where those touchdowns occurred, so perhaps they have been opportunistic as far as field position as well in forcing turnovers. 3 fumbles forced, but again, last in the SEC. in forced turnovers. As far as offense is concerned, they are 5th in offensive points per game. They scored 52 against a pretty good Louisville defense. I mean, middle of the pack ACC Louisville defense, Don. In fact, those were the most points Louisville had given up all year. And boy, Will Levis, we can talk about him, but Will Levis was just spectacular in that game. I believe 4, if I'm not mistaken, 4 rushing touchdowns for Will. And he had at least one absolutely jaw-dropping run in that game where he juked a defender out of his shoes and then he hurdled a defender in about 2 seconds time. So obviously Will is a kid I was familiar with. He played at Penn State, transferred to Kentucky, and of course Iowa was in on him hard in the recruiting process. Thought we had him, and Don, that's another one that slipped through our grasp. But how hard is it going to be for Iowa to defend him?
It's going to be a challenge, and just for the record, we were the very first school to offer him a scholarship, which I think our listeners might find interesting. I went back and checked because I was curious. I did recall that Will started the game against Iowa a year ago in representing Penn State. He did start that game. I went back and actually looked at the play-by-play. He was replaced in the third quarter after fumbling for the third time. They lost the first 2 fumbles. I believe they were both sack situations where the ball came out. And the third one, I believe, as I recall, was a run play. They did recover that one, but at that point, the coaches had seen enough. He was replaced in the third quarter. The score at the time was 31-7. So Will Levis certainly doesn't have any comfortable thought process as it relates to playing against Iowa's defense, because last year was a long day for him, certainly. This is a change of scenery, of course, in different uniforms. So I'm sure he wants to put that game behind him, but there's no way he's going to forget entirely as to what happened that day. One obvious question I have going forward, and I'm not sure what the answer is, but I am curious, how many of those turnovers, they've lost 22 turnovers for the season. That puts them at 108th. Just to give you an idea, that's total turnovers, either interceptions or fumbles lost. And I'm curious how many of those are directly attributable to him. Because last year he was involved with 2 lost fumbles against us and a third fumble that they did recover. So I'm curious if he has some of the same ball security issues maybe that Martinez has from Nebraska. You might recall he's been known to cough the ball from time to time. We need to find a way to generate turnovers, and obviously Levis the ball's in his hand so much of the time. It's logical that you need to try to get the ball out as often as you possibly can, whether it's a run or a pass.
Iowa is also familiar with Wan'Dale Robinson. He's another kid on that Kentucky offense who is dynamic, was obviously spectacular at Nebraska. Kentucky tends to, I've noticed Mark Stoops seems to like big physical receivers. And so they're going to have Iowa cornerbacks specifically. We hope Terry Roberts can get back. He was not on the most recent depth chart that was released, but we assume that will be Jamari Harris and Riley Moss. Will Levis can throw the football as well. I mean, he is a complete player. How does Iowa defend those talented wideouts?
Well, one thing for sure, we have to ID Wan'Dale Robinson all day long. This year, a school record 94 catches for 1,164 yards, 7 touchdowns. He's also run the ball 7 times. He's averaged almost 16 yards on each of those 7 carries. I did check to see what he did against us a year ago. I was hoping he had a long day at the office, just like Levis did against Iowa. But Robinson had a solid game against us last year. He had 9 catches for 75 yards. And he ran the ball 2 or 3 times, as I recall, for another 12 or 15 yards. So had a solid game in representing Nebraska. And regardless of what happened a year ago against us, we better identify him every snap. They move him around. Sometimes he's an outside receiver. I would hope that we would double him as often as possible when he's lined up on the perimeter of the formation as an outside receiver. They're not crazy enough to always have him lined up out there. Oftentimes they'll put him in a slot also. And now it's a trickier proposition to double him, although there are ways you can do it, what we refer to as combo coverages. It's possible that you could assign 2 defenders to defend against an inside receiver one would play with outside leverage, one with inside leverage, and now you effectively have him sandwiched in between two defenders. And that, of course, when you do that, you're compromising yourself somewhere else. And it's okay to do it as long as the other team doesn't pick up on it and decide to work another direction where you're more vulnerable.